Commander Yuna stood on the bridge of the Stellar Dawn, watching the strange object drift slowly through space. It was dark and broken, spinning end over end like a wounded animal. The ship looked nothing like any vessel in the galactic database. "How long has it been out here?" she asked her navigation officer. Hyok checked his instruments carefully. "The radiation patterns suggest at least 300 years, Commander." "Maybe more." Yuna nodded slowly. 300 years was a long time for anything to survive in deep space. The fact that this ship was still mostly intact meant it was built well. "Very well. Any signs of life?" she asked. Communications Officer Sora shook her head. "Nothing, Commander. No heat signatures, no electrical activity, no life support systems running. If anyone was aboard, they are long gone." The research vessel Stellar Dawn had been exploring the outer regions of known space for 2 years. Their mission was simple: find new civilizations and learn about them. The 12-member crew represented different species from across the peaceful Galactic Alliance. They had discovered many things during their journey, but nothing like this. "It doesn't match any known ship design," said Dr. Minho from his station near the back of the bridge. The xenoanthropologist was studying the vessel's shape and structure through the long-range scanners. "The hull configuration is completely unfamiliar. And those markings on the side, what about them?" Yuna asked. Minho adjusted his scanner settings. "They appear to be symbols of some kind. Not like any written language in our databases." Senior archaeologist Hajin moved closer to look at the readings. "Commander, I recommend we bring it aboard for study. This could be from an unknown civilization." Yuna considered this carefully. Finding new civilizations was exactly what they were supposed to do. But unknown ships could be dangerous. "Any signs of weapon systems?" Engineer Tae Yang ran a detailed scan of the derelict vessel. "I'm seeing some unusual structures that could be weapons, but they appear to be completely powered down. No energy readings at all." "Very well," Yuna decided. "Bring it into the main cargo bay. But I want full containment protocols. No one goes near it until we know what we're dealing with." The process of bringing the strange ship aboard took several hours. It was larger than it had appeared from a distance nearly 60 meters long. The hull was made from an unknown metal alloy that seemed incredibly strong, despite obvious damage from what looked like weapon impacts. Once the ship was secured in the cargo bay, the research team gathered to examine it more closely. Cultural analyst Seojin was the first to notice something important. "Look at these impact marks," she said, running her hand along a series of deep gouges in the hull. "These weren't made by space debris or asteroids. These are deliberate damage patterns." "What do you mean?" asked Hajin. "Someone was shooting at this ship, and they were shooting back." Seojin pointed to several areas where the hull had been repaired with what looked like makeshift patches. The crew kept fighting even after taking heavy damage. Behavioral specialist Jiwon studied the ship's design more carefully. "The entire structure seems built for conflict. Look at these reinforced sections, these armored plates. This wasn't a research vessel or a transport ship." "You think it was built for war?" asked Yuna. "I think it was built by people who expected war," Jiwon replied. The team found an airlock that was still functional. Security Chief Young-ho led a small group inside while the others monitored from outside. The interior of the ship was dark and cold, but their lights revealed something unexpected. "Commander," Young-ho's voice came through the communicator. "You need to see this." The interior of the ship was unlike anything they had encountered before. Every surface seemed designed with function in mind rather than comfort. There were no decorative elements, no artistic touches, nothing that suggested the builders cared about beauty or pleasure. "It's like they built this ship expecting to fight for their lives," whispered linguist Yunji as she examined strange symbols carved into metal panels. Field analyst Wonho discovered something even more puzzling. "Commander, there are storage compartments filled with objects I don't recognize. They look like tools, but what? But they're clearly designed to cause harm." Dr. Minho joined them inside the ship. As their xenoanthropologist, he had seen weapons from many civilizations, but these were different. "These aren't ceremonial items or tools for hunting. These were made specifically for fighting other intelligent beings." The team spent hours cataloging what they found. There were devices that could only be weapons, armor designed to protect against weapons, and communication equipment that seemed built to coordinate large groups in combat situations. "I don't understand," said Sora, as she examined a damaged computer terminal. "Why would any species build things like this?" Technical specialist Chang Min had been working on the ship's computer systems. Commander, I think I found something. The data storage systems are heavily damaged, but I might be able to recover some information. Do it, Yuna ordered. But be careful. We don't know what kind of security systems they might have had. As Changmin worked, the rest of the team continued exploring. What they found painted a picture of a civilization completely unlike their own. Everything suggested a people who lived with the constant expectation of violence. How could a species develop advanced space travel while maintaining such a focus on warfare? Wondered systems analyst Nari. In our experience, civilizations must move beyond conflict before they can reach the stars. Maybe, said Yuna thoughtfully, they reach the stars because of conflict, not despite it. After many hours of work, Changmin made a breakthrough. I've recovered some data fragments. They appear to be historical records of some kind. The team gathered around as the first images appeared on their portable display screen. What they saw left them speechless. The images showed beings that looked similar to several galactic species, but their behavior was completely different. They were organized into large groups wearing matching coverings, carrying identical weapons. They moved in coordinated patterns that suggested extensive training. Are these records of some kind of ritual? Asked Seojin. Changmin shook his head. I don't think so. Look at the damage to their surroundings. Look at the bodies. The images showed aftermath scenes that the peaceful galactic species had never witnessed. Structures destroyed by violence, landscapes scarred by weapons, and evidence of large-scale conflict between organized groups. This can't be real, said Yunji quietly. No intelligent species would do this to each other. But as more images appeared, it became clear that not only was it real, but it was systematic. These beings had turned conflict into a science, developing increasingly sophisticated methods of organized violence. Commander, said Hajin slowly, I think we've found something unprecedented. A species that not only survived warfare, but used it to drive their development. Yuna stared at the images, trying to understand what she was seeing. But how did they survive? How did they advance? According to everything we know about civilization development, this level of internal conflict should have destroyed them. Changmin continued recovering data fragments. There's more here, Commander, much more. These records span thousands of years. Thousands of years of warfare? Asked Yuna. Thousands of years of survival through warfare, Minho corrected. And if this ship is any indication, they not only survived, but eventually reached the stars. As the team processed this information, they realized they had discovered something that challenged everything they thought they knew about how civilizations developed. These beings had taken a completely different path to the stars, one built on conflict rather than cooperation. What do we call them? Asked Sora. Yuna looked at the data still being recovered, showing more images of these remarkable beings who had somehow turned warfare into a tool for advancement, rather than destruction. We call them survivors, she said finally, and we need to learn everything we can about how they did it. 3 days had passed since the discovery of the strange ship. Researcher Do-hyun had barely slept during that time. He spent every waking hour in the deep analysis chambers, working to piece together the fragments of data they had recovered. I think I understand their early history, he announced to the assembled team, but you're not going to believe what I found. Commander Yuna leaned forward in her chair. Show us. Do-hyun activated the holographic display system. The chamber filled with light as images began to form in the air around them. What appeared was a landscape unlike anything the peaceful species had ever seen. This is from their ancient past, Do-hyun explained, thousands of years before they reached space. The hologram showed vast armies of beings marching across open fields. They wore metal coverings over their bodies and carried long, pointed weapons. Their movements were perfectly coordinated, like parts of a single machine. They're so organized, whispered Yunji the linguist. How many are there? According to the records, sometimes hundreds of thousands in a single battle, Do-hyun replied. The team watched in stunned silence as the hologram showed these ancient warriors engaging in massive conflicts. The precision of their movements, the complexity of their tactics, and the scale of their battles was beyond anything they had imagined. But why? Asked Seojin, the cultural analyst. What were they fighting over? Do-hyun had been studying that question for days. Territory, resources, ideas about how society should work. But here's what's really interesting. They didn't just fight randomly. They had rules. Rules for fighting? Yuna couldn't hide her confusion. "Watch this," Do-hyun said, changing the display. The new images showed warriors in different types of armor and weapons. Some rode on four-legged animals, others fought on foot. But in every scene there were clear patterns of behavior. They developed codes of honor, Do-hyun explained. They had specific ways they were supposed to treat enemies who surrendered. They protected certain types of people during conflicts. They even had rules about when and where fighting was allowed. Dr. Minho studied the images carefully. "You're telling us they created moral systems around warfare?" "Not just moral systems. They created entire social structures based on it." Do-hyun showed new images of great stone buildings and organized communities. Their greatest leaders were their greatest warriors. Their most respected members of society were those who had proven themselves in battle. Engineer Taeyang was examining the weapons and armor shown in the holograms. "The level of technological development is remarkable. Look at the metallurgy required to create armor like that. And these weapons, the engineering principles are quite advanced." "That's what I find most fascinating," said Do-hyun. "They didn't develop technology despite warfare. They developed it because of warfare." He showed them images of massive stone fortifications, complex siege weapons, and intricate armor designs. Each innovation represented a solution to a military problem. Every advance in their metalworking came from trying to make better weapons or stronger armor. Do-hyun continued. Their understanding of engineering came from building better defenses. Even their medicine advanced because they needed to treat battle injuries. Behavioral specialist Ji-won was deeply troubled by what she was seeing. How did they survive as a species? This level of internal conflict should have led to extinction. "That's the remarkable part," Do-hyun said, calling up new images. "They learned to channel warfare into something productive." The display showed different groups of these beings, each with distinct armor and weapon styles. They organized themselves into competing groups, but they also created alliances. They fought each other, but they also fought together against common threats. "Common threats?" asked Yuna. Do-hyun showed images of battles against creatures that looked nothing like the warriors themselves. Natural disasters, dangerous animals, hostile environments. When faced with external threats, the competing groups would unite. Field analyst Won-ho had been quietly studying the tactical formations shown in the holograms. "Commander, their strategic thinking is incredibly sophisticated. These aren't mindless conflicts. Every movement has purpose, every formation serves a specific tactical goal." "Show me what you mean," Yuna said. Won-ho manipulated the display to highlight specific battle formations. "See how they coordinate infantry with cavalry? How they use terrain to their advantage? How they maintain supply lines across vast distances? This represents centuries of tactical evolution." The team watched as Won-ho broke down the components of ancient battles, showing how these warriors had developed complex strategies for coordination, communication, and logistics. They turned warfare into a science, Won-ho concluded, and that scientific approach to conflict resolution drove innovation in every other field. Linguist Yoonji had been working on translating written records that accompanied the images. "I've been studying their written accounts of these battles. They kept detailed records of what worked and what didn't. They studied their failures and shared successful tactics. They created military academies," she continued, showing translated text alongside the images. Formal institutions dedicated to studying warfare and training leaders. But these institutions also became centers of learning for engineering, medicine, and logistics. Systems analyst Nari was fascinated by the organizational aspects. The level of coordination required for these large-scale conflicts must have driven the development of advanced communication and record-keeping systems. "Exactly," agreed Do-hyun. They invented new forms of mathematics to calculate supply requirements. They developed new materials to make lighter, stronger equipment. They created new medicines to keep their warriors healthy. Cultural analyst Seo Jin had been studying the social implications. What's remarkable is that they maintained cultural development alongside military development. Look at these artistic representations of warriors, these elaborate ceremonies, these detailed historical accounts. She showed images of beautiful artwork depicting battle scenes, intricate weapons that were clearly ceremonial as well as functional, and elaborate rituals surrounding warfare. "They didn't just fight," Seojin observed. "They created entire cultures around the idea of honorable combat. Commander Yuna had been silent for most of the presentation, trying to process what she was learning. Finally, she spoke. In our experience, species that engage in this level of internal conflict destroy themselves long before achieving space travel. But somehow these beings use conflict as a tool for advancement. Not just advancement, corrected Dr. Minho. Survival. Every innovation, every social structure, every technological development served the ultimate goal of species survival in a dangerous universe. Do-hyun nodded. And this is just their ancient history. The data fragments suggest their approach to conflict became even more sophisticated over time. More sophisticated how? Asked Yuna. They learned to fight wars without destroying what they were fighting to protect. They developed ways to minimize casualties while achieving strategic objectives. They created international systems to prevent conflicts from escalating beyond control. The team sat in stunned silence, trying to understand beings so fundamentally different from themselves. There's something else, Do-hyun added quietly. The records suggest they eventually took this approach to conflict resolution beyond their own world. What do you mean? Yuna asked, though she was beginning to suspect the answer. I mean, they became very good at fighting threats that existed outside their own species. The implications of this statement settled over the team like a heavy weight. These ancient warriors had not only survived and thrived through conflict, they had become specialists at protecting themselves and others from external dangers. How much more data do we have? Yuna asked. Enough to keep us busy for weeks, Do-hyun replied. And what we've seen so far is just the beginning of their story. Cultural analyst Seo-jin had taken over the deep analysis chambers. For 5 days, she had been reconstructing the later periods of the warrior species development. What she found was both horrifying and impressive. You need to see this, she called to the other team members. But I warn you, it's much worse than what we've seen before. The team gathered in the simulation chambers as Seo-jin activated the recovered data from what appeared to be a more recent time period in the species history. This is from approximately 500 years after the ancient period Do-hyun showed you, Seo-jin explained. Their technology had advanced significantly. The holographic display filled with images of massive battles involving thousands of warriors. But these conflicts were different from the ancient ones. The warriors used weapons that could kill from great distances. They fought from inside metal vehicles that moved without animals to pull them. The scale is enormous, whispered Security Chief Young-ho. How many are involved in these conflicts? Millions, Seo-jin replied grimly. Sometimes tens of millions in a single war. Engineer Tai-yang studied the weapons and vehicles shown in the display. The technological sophistication is remarkable. These projectile weapons, these armored vehicles, these flying machines, they represent centuries of rapid development. That's what I find most disturbing, said Seo-jin. They developed all this technology specifically for warfare. But look at the unintended consequences. She showed images of the aftermath of these massive conflicts. Entire cities reduced to rubble. Landscapes scarred by explosive weapons. Evidence of destruction on a scale that dwarfed anything from their ancient period. They nearly destroyed themselves, observed Dr. Minho. How did they survive this level of devastation? By learning from it, Seo-jin replied. Watch what happens after each major conflict. The display showed the aftermath of great battles. But instead of continuing the destruction, the survivors began rebuilding. More importantly, they began organizing. They created international agreements, Seo-jin explained, rules that all groups had to follow during conflicts. They established organizations dedicated to helping those hurt by warfare. Behavioral specialist Ji-won was studying the social changes shown in the data. They developed compassion alongside destruction. Look at these images of warriors helping enemy wounded. These accounts of soldiers sharing food with prisoners. They created moral frameworks that limited warfare's worst effects, agreed Seo-jin. But they never stopped fighting entirely. The team watched. As the display showed the development of increasingly sophisticated weapons alongside increasingly sophisticated rules about how those weapons could be used. It's a paradox, said Communications Officer Sora. They became more destructive and more humane at the same time. Field Analyst Wanho was fascinated by the strategic evolution. Their tactical thinking became incredibly complex. They developed strategies for fighting multiple enemies simultaneously. They learned to coordinate land, sea, and air forces in integrated campaigns. But look at the cost, said Seo-jin. showing images of massive industrial facilities dedicated to producing weapons. They organized their entire societies around warfare. Millions of individuals worked in facilities that produced nothing but instruments of destruction. Engineer Tai Yang was examining these industrial images closely. Wait, these facilities weren't just producing weapons. Look at these production lines, these quality control systems, these logistical networks. What do you mean? Asked Commander Yuna. They developed mass production techniques, advanced manufacturing processes, and complex supply chain management. All for warfare, but these same techniques could be applied to anything. Technical specialist Chang Min had been analyzing the technical data embedded in the images. The precision engineering required for these weapons is extraordinary. The materials science, the chemistry, the physics, they were pushing the boundaries of what was possible. Necessity drove innovation, observed Dr. Minho. They needed better weapons, so they developed better technology. They needed to coordinate larger armies, so they developed better communication systems. Seojin showed them images of the species' first flying machines. They developed powered flight primarily for military reconnaissance. But once they had the technology, they began using it for transportation and exploration. The same pattern appears everywhere, she continued, showing more examples. They developed advanced medicine to treat battle wounds. They developed better materials to make stronger armor. They developed new forms of energy to power their weapons. Systems analyst Nari was studying the organizational changes. The level of coordination required for these massive conflicts led to revolutionary changes in how they structured their societies. They developed new forms of government, new economic systems, new methods of education. All driven by military necessity, agreed Seojin, but with applications far beyond warfare. The team watched as the display showed the gradual development of technologies that would eventually enable space travel. Rocket technology developed for weapons delivery. Advanced materials created for military applications. Communication systems designed for battlefield coordination. They reached the stars on the back of military technology, realized Young-ho. But there's something else, Seojin said, her voice troubled. The conflicts shown in this data weren't just between different groups of their own species. She activated new images that showed battles against beings that looked completely different. From the warrior species, they fought other intelligent species, asked Yuna. Defended against them, Seojin corrected. The data suggests that other species attempted to invade their world. The massive military infrastructure they had developed for internal conflicts became the foundation for defending against external threats. The implications were staggering. This warrior species had not only survived internal warfare, but had used the military capabilities developed during those conflicts to protect themselves from alien invasion. How successful were they? Asked Dr. Minho. Seojin showed the final images from this time period. They depicted the warrior species' military forces pursuing retreating alien vessels beyond their own world's atmosphere. Very successful, she said quietly. They didn't just defend themselves. They counterattacked. Linguist Yunji had been working on translating written records from this period. The documents I've translated suggest they considered defense of their world a sacred duty. They viewed external threats as existential challenges that required total commitment. They militarized their entire civilization, observed Jiwon. But they did it to protect what they valued. Commander Yuna studied the images of these ancient space battles. The ship we found, it's from a much later period, which means they continued this pattern of development. They became very good at warfare, said Seojin, perhaps better than any species in the galaxy. But why? Asked Sora. Why maintain such a focus on conflict when they had achieved space travel? Seojin looked at her colleagues gravely. Because they learned something that our peaceful civilizations never had to learn, which is that the universe is not a safe place, and sometimes the only way to protect peace is to be prepared for war. The team sat in contemplative silence, trying to process the implications of what they had discovered. This warrior species had taken a completely different evolutionary path, one that their own peaceful civilizations had never considered necessary. There's more data to analyze, Seojin said finally. The records suggest their approach to warfare became even more sophisticated as they expanded into space. Show us, commanded Yuna. We need to understand how this story ends. Navigation Officer Hyok had been analyzing the most technically complex data recovered from the derelict ship. What he discovered challenged everything the galactic community believed about space exploration. Their expansion into space was fundamentally different from ours, Hyok announced to the assembled research team. We developed space travel through scientific curiosity and the desire to explore. They developed it through military competition. The holographic display showed images of massive rocket vehicles launching from the warrior species' homeworld. But these weren't the peaceful exploration vessels that other species had built. Everything was driven by competition between different groups within their species, Hyok continued. They raced to put weapons in orbit, to establish military bases on their moon, to claim strategic positions throughout their solar system. Engineer Taiyang examined the technical specifications embedded in the recovered data. The rate of technological advancement is incredible. They went from first achieving orbit to establishing permanent space installations in less than 50 years. 50 years, exclaimed Dr. Minho. It took our species 3 centuries to achieve permanent space. Habitation. Military necessity accelerated. Everything, explained Hyok. They couldn't afford to take centuries. If one group achieved space-based military superiority, it could dominate all the others. The display showed the gradual militarization of their entire solar system. Weapons platforms in orbit around their homeworld, military bases on multiple moons and asteroids, combat vessels patrolling between planets. But they also developed civilian space infrastructure, noted systems analyst Nari. Communication satellites, navigation systems, resource extraction facilities, all with potential military applications, Hyok pointed out. Their communication satellites could coordinate military operations. Their navigation systems could guide weapons to targets. Their mining operations provided materials for building more military hardware. Technical specialist Chang Min was fascinated by the dual-use nature of their space technology. Every civilian application had military potential. Every military system had civilian benefits. They created an integrated space-based civilization built around the concept of strategic competition. The team studied images of massive space-based construction projects, orbital manufacturing facilities, asteroid mining operations, research stations on distant moons. The scale of their space-based industry is enormous, observed Taiyang. They built in decades what it would take our peaceful civilization centuries to achieve. Because they had to, said Hyok. Military competition drove innovation, but it also drove production. They couldn't just develop new technology. They had to mass-produce it quickly and efficiently. Behavioral specialist Jiwan was studying the social implications of this militarized space development. How did they maintain civilian society while building such extensive military infrastructure? They integrated them, replied Hyok. Military service became a normal part of civilian life. Most members of their species spent part of their lives in military roles, then transitioned to civilian occupations that supported military objectives. The display showed images of training facilities where young members of the species learned both civilian skills and military capabilities. Educational institutions that taught engineering alongside tactical planning. Research centers that developed both consumer products and weapons systems. They created a civilization where the distinction between military and civilian became meaningless, observed cultural analyst Seojin. Everyone was a potential warrior, but also a potential scientist, engineer, or explorer. Field analyst Wanho had been studying their space-based tactical doctrines. Their strategic planning became incredibly sophisticated. They developed contingency plans for conflicts throughout their solar system. They prepared for threats from outside their system before they had even detected any. They planned for fighting enemies they had never met, added Security Chief Young Ho. Look at these training scenarios. Combat operations against hypothetical alien species with unknown capabilities. The team examined detailed military exercises designed to prepare for first contact with hostile alien civilizations. The warrior species had developed tactics for fighting in zero gravity, on worlds with different atmospheric compositions, and against enemies with completely unknown technologies. They assumed the worst, said Dr. Minho. They prepared for the possibility that any new species they encountered might be hostile, and they were right to do so, Hyok said grimly, calling up new images. The display showed the first evidence of contact between the warrior species and actual alien civilizations, but these weren't peaceful first contact scenarios like those experienced by other galactic species. They were invaded, Hyok explained, multiple times by different species. The images showed massive space battles involving hundreds of vessels. The warrior species' military infrastructure, developed through centuries of internal competition, became the foundation for defending against external threats. How did they perform? Asked Commander Yuna. See for yourself, Hyok replied. The display showed the aftermath of these space battles. Alien invasion fleets retreating or destroyed. The warrior species forces pursuing defeated enemies back to their home systems. Evidence of successful defensive operations that protected not just their own world, but other peaceful planets and surrounding systems. They didn't just defend themselves, realized Yuna. They defended others. The data suggests they established a protective perimeter around peaceful civilizations throughout this region of the galaxy, confirmed. Hyok, species that couldn't defend themselves, were shielded by the warrior. Species military capabilities. Linguist. Yunji had been translating communication records from these conflicts. The documents suggest they considered protection of peaceful species to be a moral obligation. They viewed their military capabilities as tools for defending those who couldn't defend themselves. They became the galaxy's guardians, said Jiwan quietly. Professional warriors whose job was to fight so others didn't have to. Communications Officer Sora was studying the technical aspects of their space-based military operations. Their communication systems allowed coordination across multiple star systems. Their logistics networks could supply military operations at interstellar distances. Their intelligence-gathering capabilities provided early warning of threats from deep space. They built a military infrastructure that spanned dozens of star systems, added Changmin, all focused on detecting and neutralizing threats before they could reach peaceful civilizations. The team studied images of the warrior species' advanced space-based facilities, massive shipyards that could construct entire fleets, research stations that developed increasingly sophisticated weapons and defensive systems, training facilities that prepared warriors for combat in any environment. But this level of military development must have required enormous resources, observed Taeyang. It did, agreed Hyok, but they found ways to make their military infrastructure economically sustainable. He showed images of the warrior species' space-based industries. Their military shipyards also produced civilian vessels. Their weapons research led to advances in energy generation and materials science. Their training facilities became educational institutions that produced engineers, scientists, and explorers alongside warriors. They created a circular economy where military development drove technological advancement, which enabled further military development, which protected the peaceful civilizations, that provided resources and support, explained Hyok. A sustainable system of galactic defense, realized Dr. Minho. Which brings us to the final question, said Commander Yuna. If they built such an effective defensive system, what happened to them? Hyok's expression became grave. That's what we need to find out. But the evidence suggests they encountered something that challenged even their capabilities. The team looked at each other, understanding that they were about to learn something that might change their understanding of the galaxy itself. How much more data do we have? Asked Yuna. Enough to answer that question, Hyok replied. But you may not like what we find. Technical specialist Changmin had spent days working to unlock the derelict ship's most advanced systems. When he finally succeeded, what he discovered left the entire research team speechless. This isn't just a military vessel, Changmin announced to his colleagues. This is a mobile fortress designed for extended operations, in deep space against threats we can't even imagine. The activated systems revealed the true sophistication of the warrior species' space-based military technology. Every surface of the ship seemed to serve multiple functions. Weapon systems were integrated with defensive barriers. Communication arrays doubled as sensor networks. Even the crew quarters were designed to function as emergency command centers. The level of technological integration is beyond anything in our databases, said engineer Taeyang. Studying the ship's technical specifications, they didn't just build weapons and attach them to a ship. They built a weapon that happened to have living spaces inside it. Security Chief Young-ho was examining the ship's combat systems in detail. These weapons can adapt to different types of targets automatically. The defensive systems can reconfigure themselves based on the type of incoming attack. The entire vessel can modify its capabilities during combat. Adaptive warfare technology, observed Dr. Minho. They built ships that could learn and evolve during battle. The team discovered that the ship's computer systems contained detailed tactical analyses of conflicts against multiple alien species, not just the invasions of their home system, but encounters with dozens of different hostile civilizations throughout the galaxy. They fought species we've never even heard of, said systems analyst Nari, reviewing the tactical databases. And they developed specific strategies for each type of enemy they encountered. The combat records showed engagements against silicon-based life forms that could survive in hard vacuum, energy beings that could exist as pure information, and hive mind species that operated with perfect coordination across vast distances. How did they prepare for fighting enemies they had never seen before? Asked behavioral specialist Jiwan, Changmin activated the ship's training simulation systems. They created virtual enemies based on theoretical possibilities. Then they practiced fighting those simulated threats until they could defeat any variation they might encounter. The simulation chamber filled with holographic representations of bizarre alien creatures and exotic weapons. The research team watched as recordings showed the warrior species soldiers training against every conceivable type of threat. They didn't just prepare for known enemies, realized field analyst Wanho. They prepared for unknown enemies by imagining every possible form that hostility might take. Cultural analyst Seojin was studying the psychological profiles embedded in the ship's personnel files. The individuals who crewed these vessels were selected and trained specifically for deep space combat operations. But they weren't just warriors. What do you mean? Asked Commander Yuna. They were scientists, engineers, diplomats, and explorers who also happened to be the most effective fighters in the galaxy, Seojin explained. Each crew member could perform multiple roles. The personnel records showed that the ship's crew included experts in xenobiology who could analyze alien life forms, engineers who could adapt their technology to counter unknown weapons, and linguists who could establish communication with new species. They were designed to make first contact with new civilizations, realized linguist Yunji. But they were also prepared to fight those civilizations if necessary. Navigation, Officer Hyuk had been studying the ship's mission logs. This particular vessel was part of a patrol network that monitored the galactic periphery. They were looking for new threats before those threats could discover the location of peaceful civilizations. A early warning system, said Dr. Minho. They positioned themselves between potential dangers and the species they were protecting. The mission logs revealed the true scope of the warrior species' defensive operations. Hundreds of ships patrolling the galaxy's outer regions, monitoring stations established in uninhabited systems, intelligence networks that tracked the movement of potentially hostile civilizations across thousands of light years. They created a defensive perimeter around the entire galactic community, said Yuna with growing amazement. And most species never even knew it existed. Communications officer Sora had been analyzing the ship's communication records. They maintained contact with peaceful civilizations, but they disguised their true purpose. They appeared to be explorers, traders, or researchers, but they were actually gathering intelligence and assessing defensive needs. Covert protection, observed Youngho. They defended species who didn't even know they needed defending. The team discovered records of the warrior species preventing dozens of potential invasions, stopping aggressive civilizations before they could attack peaceful worlds, and resolving conflicts between species through strategic intervention. They weren't just warriors, realized Jiwan. They were galactic peacekeepers. Technical specialist Changmin had been working to access the ship's most recent operational records. I think I've found what happened to the crew of this particular vessel. The display showed the ship's final mission. It had detected an incoming threat from outside the galaxy, a massive armada of vessels unlike anything in their tactical databases. Extragalactic invasion, said Changmin quietly, something from beyond our galaxy that viewed all intelligent life as a threat to be eliminated. The record showed the warrior species' response to this unprecedented danger. Every available ship was called back from patrol duty. The entire defensive network was restructured to meet this new threat. They abandoned their usual strategy of preventing conflicts before they began, explained Changmin. Instead, they positioned themselves to fight a direct battle against an enemy that wanted to destroy everything. The final battle had been unlike anything in the warrior species' history. Not a conflict over resources or territory, but a fight for the survival of all galactic civilization. How did it end? Asked Yuna. Changmin showed them the last entries in the ship's log. The crew had engaged the invasion force at the galaxy's edge, along with hundreds of other warrior vessels. The battle had lasted for months. They won, Changmin said simply, but at enormous cost. The record showed that the warrior species had sacrificed most of their fleet to stop the extragalactic invasion. The surviving ships, too damaged to continue normal operations, had been abandoned in deep space. The crew didn't die in battle, Changmin continued. They evacuated to other vessels before this ship became too damaged to maintain life support. But the ship itself represents the end of an era. What do you mean? Asked Dr. Minho. The warrior species' ability to maintain their galaxy-wide defensive network was broken by this battle. They no longer had enough ships or personnel to patrol the outer regions. The team sat in stunned silence, processing the implications of what they had learned. So the peaceful galactic civilizations are no longer protected? Asked Sora. Changmin reviewed the final intelligence reports embedded in the ship's databases. Some protection remains, but much less than before. The warrior species still exists, but in much smaller numbers. And there might be other extragalactic threats, added Yuna grimly. The record suggests that's very likely, confirmed Changmin. The invasion they stopped was apparently just the first of several that were planned. The research team looked around at each other, understanding that they had discovered something that would change their understanding of galactic politics forever. What do we do with this information? Asked Yunji. Commander Yuna considered the question carefully. The warrior species had sacrificed themselves to protect civilizations that didn't even know they needed protection. Now those same civilizations faced potential threats without their guardians. We need to understand the complete story, she said finally. There might be more survivors than we realize. And we need to know what's still out there. Chief Researcher Borum had worked for weeks to decode the ship's final logs. When she finally succeeded, she called an emergency meeting of the entire research team. What I'm about to show you will change everything we thought we knew about our peaceful galaxy, Borum announced. But it will also explain why we've been able to remain peaceful. The team gathered in the main briefing chamber as Borum activated the ship's most protected data files. What appeared was a comprehensive record of the warrior species' final operations. This ship wasn't just part of a defensive network, Borum explained. It was part of the last major operation the warrior species ever conducted. The holographic display showed star charts marked with the positions of hundreds of vessels. But these weren't random patrol routes. They were carefully coordinated defensive positions surrounding the entire galactic community. They had been monitoring extragalactic space for decades, Borum continued. They knew that threats from outside our galaxy were inevitable. Intelligence Officer Minji had been analyzing the strategic intelligence embedded in the files. The warrior species identified at least 7 different extragalactic civilizations that viewed our galaxy as a target for conquest or resource extraction. The display showed long-range sensor data revealing massive fleets moving through the void between galaxies. Each fleet was larger than the combined space forces of all known peaceful civilizations. How is that possible? Asked Dr. Minho. How could civilizations exist in the empty space between galaxies? They're nomadic, explained Borum. Species that have consumed all the resources in their home galaxies and now move from galaxy to galaxy, stripping each one of life and useful materials before moving on. The team studied images of the nomadic fleets, massive vessels built from the remains of destroyed worlds, technology that combined the knowledge of dozens of conquered species, military forces that had been perfected through the conquest of entire galaxies. The warrior species knew they were coming, continued Borum, and they knew that our peaceful civilizations would be helpless against them. So, they prepared to fight alone, realized Commander Yuna. Not alone, Borum corrected. They had allies we never knew about. The display showed communication records between the warrior species and other civilizations throughout the galaxy. But these weren't the peaceful species the research team knew about. There are other warrior cultures in our galaxy, Borum explained. Species that, like humans, developed through conflict and maintained military capabilities. The team saw records of coordination between multiple warrior species, each contributing their specialized capabilities to the galaxy's defense. Some were experts in space combat, others specialized in planetary defense. Still others provided intelligence and logistical support. An alliance of guardians, said Security Chief Young-ho. Multiple species working together to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Exactly, agreed Borum. And their final operation was the most ambitious military campaign in galactic history. The display showed the battle plan for intercepting the extragalactic invasion. The Warrior Alliance had positioned their forces at strategic points throughout the galaxy's outer regions, creating a defensive network that would engage the invaders long before they could reach inhabited worlds. The battle lasted for 2 years, Borum said quietly. It was fought in empty space far from any peaceful civilization. Most of the galaxy never even knew it was happening. Navigation Officer Hyok studied the tactical records. The strategic complexity is incredible. They coordinated operations across thousands of light years, managing supply lines, reinforcements, and intelligence, sharing between dozens of different species. But they were outnumbered, observed Field Analyst Wanho. The extragalactic forces were at least 10 times larger than the defending alliance, which is why they had to use unconventional tactics, said Borum. They couldn't win through direct confrontation, so they used the invaders' own strengths against them. The battle record showed how the Warrior Alliance had allowed the invasion force to advance into the galaxy, then systematically destroyed their supply lines and isolated their combat units. Instead of fighting massive fleet battles, they conducted thousands of smaller engagements designed to gradually wear down the larger force. Asymmetric warfare, realized Wanho. They turned the invasion into exactly the type of conflict they were best equipped to fight. And it worked, said Borum. After 2 years, the surviving invasion forces retreated back to extragalactic space. Surviving forces? Asked Communications Officer Sora. Some of them escaped? Borum's expression became grave. About 30% of the invasion force survived the retreat, and the intelligence we recovered suggests they weren't the only extragalactic threat. The display showed long-range sensor data indicating the movement of additional nomadic fleets in the void beyond the galaxy. How many? Asked Yuna. At least 3 more invasion forces of similar size, replied Borum, and possibly others that our sensors haven't detected yet. The implications were staggering. The peaceful galactic civilizations faced multiple existential threats, and their protectors had been severely weakened by their successful defense. What happened to the Warrior Alliance after the battle? Asked Dr. Minho. They were broken, Borum replied sadly. 70% casualties across all allied species. Most of their advanced ships destroyed or too damaged to repair. Their manufacturing bases depleted of resources. The display showed the aftermath of the Great Battle, damaged vessels limping back to home systems, warrior populations reduced to small fractions of their former strength, industrial infrastructure that had been converted entirely to military production. But they didn't give up, Borum continued. The survivors reorganized into smaller, more mobile units. Instead of maintaining a galaxy-wide defensive network, they established rapid response teams that could move quickly to counter specific threats. Intelligence Officer Minji had been analyzing the post-battle organizational records. The new structure is much more efficient but covers far less territory. They can respond to direct invasions of inhabited systems, but they can't prevent threats from entering the galaxy. Which means the next extragalactic invasion will get much closer to peaceful worlds before it's detected and engaged, realized Engineer Taeyang. Borum nodded grimly. The warrior species and their allies are still out there, still protecting the galaxy, but they're operating with a fraction of their former capabilities. Cultural analyst Seojin had been studying the social implications of the Warrior Alliance's sacrifice. They gave up their own civilizations to protect ours. Most of their population was either killed in battle or converted their entire society to support the war effort. And, the peaceful species never knew, added behavioral specialist Ji-won. We continued our normal lives while they fought and died to preserve our way of life. The research team sat in contemplative silence, processing the magnitude of what they had discovered. Their peaceful galactic civilization existed only because warrior species had chosen to bear the burden of protecting it. "There's something else," said Borum quietly. "The final logs contain a message." "A message?" asked Commander Yuna. "From the human commander of this vessel, addressed to whoever might eventually find the ship." Borum activated the ship's communication system. A holographic figure appeared, tall, wearing battle-scarred armor, with the bearing of someone who had seen too much combat. The figure spoke in the human language, but the ship's translation system converted the words for the research team to understand. "To whoever finds this record," the human commander began, "know that your peaceful existence was not accidental. For thousands of years, warrior species have stood guard at the galaxy's edge, fighting threats you never knew existed." The commander's image gestured to displays showing the scope of the defensive operations. "We did not fight because we loved violence. We fought because we understood that peace is fragile, and that someone must be willing to pay the price to preserve it. The universe is not a safe place. It contains forces that view all life as either a resource to exploit or a threat to eliminate." The holographic figure paused, as if choosing words carefully. "The battle we fought was successful, but it was not the last. More threats will come. The surviving warrior species will meet them as best we can, but our numbers are few and our resources limited. The galaxy's peaceful civilizations may need to learn that their safety requires more than good intentions." The message continued with technical details about remaining defensive, capabilities and early warning systems that peaceful species could establish to support the reduced warrior alliance. "We do not ask you to become warriors," the commander concluded. "We ask only that you remember that your peace was purchased with our sacrifice, and that you consider what you might contribute to preserving it." The holographic figure saluted and disappeared, leaving the research team in stunned silence. "What do we do with this information?" asked linguist Yunji finally. Commander Yuna looked around at her team, representatives of 12 peaceful species who had just learned that their entire way of life depended on the sacrifices of warriors they had never known existed. "We have a choice," she said slowly. We can return to our worlds and report this as an interesting archaeological discovery, or we can accept the responsibility that comes with knowledge." "What kind of responsibility?" asked technical specialist Changmin. "The responsibility to ensure that the peaceful civilizations can continue to exist, even if the remaining warriors can't protect us forever." Systems analyst Nari understood immediately. "You're talking about preparing our own defenses." "I'm talking about acknowledging reality," Yuna replied. "The universe contains threats that our peaceful philosophy cannot simply wish away. The warrior species bought us time to develop and flourish, but they may not be able to buy us much more." Dr. Minho was studying the technical specifications the human commander had included with the message. "Their defensive technologies are far beyond anything our civilizations have developed, but the basic principles could be adapted for peaceful species. Defensive systems only," emphasized Security Chief Young-ho. "We're not talking about becoming aggressive. We're talking about being able to protect ourselves if the remaining warriors can't protect us." The team spent hours discussing the implications of their discovery. They could return to their peaceful worlds and say nothing, allowing their civilizations to remain ignorant of the dangers surrounding them. Or they could reveal the truth and potentially transform galactic civilization forever. "There's another consideration," said Communications Officer Sora. "The remaining warrior species are still out there, still fighting to protect us. They could probably use support." "What kind of support?" asked Yuna. "Resources, technology, intelligence sharing. We have capabilities they lack, just as they have capabilities we lack." Borum had been studying the Warrior Alliance's resource requirements. The message includes specifications for materials and equipment that could help them maintain their defensive operations. Most of it could be produced by peaceful civilizations without compromising their non-aggressive principles. Medical supplies, raw materials, communication equipment, added engineer Taiyang. Things that support defensive operations without directly contributing to warfare. The team realized they were discussing the creation of a new type of relationship between peaceful and warrior civilizations, one based on mutual support rather than ignorance. We could establish covert supply lines, suggested Intelligence Officer Minji. Peaceful species could contribute resources while maintaining their non-aggressive cultures, and the warrior species could continue their protective mission with better support, added Field Analyst Wanho. Commander Yuna made her decision. We returned to our respective governments with 2 recommendations. First, that the peaceful galactic civilizations begin developing basic defensive capabilities. Second, that we establish covert support networks for the warrior species who are still protecting us. Both recommendations will be controversial, warned cultural analyst Seojin. Many peaceful species will resist the idea that their security requires preparation for conflict. Then we present it as insurance, replied Yuna. We don't ask them to become warriors. We ask them to acknowledge that their peace requires protection and that they have a responsibility to contribute to that protection. The research team spent the remaining weeks of their mission documenting everything they had discovered. They prepared detailed reports that could convince their governments of the necessity of supporting galactic defense while preserving the secrecy that allowed warrior species to operate effectively. When the Stellar Dawn finally returned to inhabited space, its crew carried with them knowledge that would fundamentally change the relationship between peaceful and warrior civilizations throughout the galaxy. Commander Yuna kept the small human combat knife that Borum had found aboard the derelict vessel. It served as a reminder that peace without the means to protect it is merely an invitation for those who would destroy it. 6 months later, the first covert supply shipments began reaching warrior outposts at the galaxy's edge. The supplies were labeled as materials for deep space research, but they enabled the remaining defenders to maintain their protective mission. The peaceful civilizations never officially acknowledged the existence of their protectors, but they quietly began developing the defensive capabilities that might one day allow them to protect themselves. And in the void between galaxies, new nomadic fleets continued their slow approach toward a galaxy that now knew it was not as defenseless as it appeared. The cosmic learners had discovered that Earth's legacy of warfare was not primitive barbarism, but the foundation of galactic civilization survival. And they had learned that sometimes the greatest act of peace is the willingness to fight for those who cannot fight for themselves.